Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Exercise is Bullshit. I'm your host, Logan Emmett Hurley. So excited to be joined today by one of my favorite guests, one of my favorite buddies, one of my favorite colleagues in the industry, the man, the myth, the beard, the legend, Jack O0sten. Osteen? Oosten? I always get it wrong.
You nailed it the first time, bro.
Okay. I
Oosten,
don't
yeah.
remember what I said. O0sten. Okay. And
Whatever you want to
obviously,
call me, I'll respond to it.
bullshit, as we all know, stands for bros, utilizing logical lifting and scientific heuristics to inform training. Sticking with it. Okay, we're going forward. We're full steam ahead. So, Jack, so excited to have you back, man. Today we're going to be talking about something that I think is really often overlooked. People are in camps in either direction. We're going to be talking about speed of movement. Before we get started today, though, I just want to sort of reintroduce our listeners to you. It's obviously been a little bit of time since our last podcast, so why don't you give us a little introduction of yourself, what your specialty is, how long you've been in the game, all that kind of stuff. Tell us a little bit about Jacked&Leen. If you want to give the listeners a little update on what you told me earlier about the gym that's going to be opening up soon, I think that'd be awesome as well. But I'll let you just dive in.
Yeah, so I'm the Jack of Jacked&Leen. My wife's name's Eileen. So we run a health coaching business. I don't want to call it health coaching because it just encompasses so much. Bodybuilding, functional health restoration, all kinds of cool stuff. But we take a very holistic approach to fitness, nutrition, training, sleep, stress management, all that kind of stuff. So when we are looking at solving someone's problem to get them to the most well-rounded, robust, badass version of themselves possible, we take a very holistic approach. So everything we look at is, what can we do to tailor that experience to the individual to help get them the best results possible. So we know in-person training, online training, everything. We just want to make people, again, well-rounded, robust, badass humans that are hard to kill. Yep.
There I am. I muted myself and I don't know what I'm doing in this app. So I apologize. Yes, harder to kill is great, and that's obviously something that all of us are looking for, right? So why don't you tell us a little bit, just the super abridged version of how you got started in this? Because we have similar backgrounds of where we sort of got started in the fitness industry. We don't have to name any names. I'd prefer if we didn't. But how did you get here? What's sort of your history coming to become Jacked&Leen to start this business that you guys have started?
Yeah, so I've been a coach now for about 10 years, and it's been an evolution, as I think most coaches ultimately go through. Got into it for my own desire to be more fit and look better naked, all the traditional bro stuff back in college. I want girls to like me. And as I've grown in my experience in industry, my beard has as well, to signify the amount of knowledge that I've gained. But it really started with just personal training, and as I've learned more about, again, this holistic approach to wellness, I've evolved, and I've trained at many different types of gyms, different types of studios, implementing different types of practices. So I've really been kind of around the block. And what we're arrived at now is like this Jacked&Leen, again, methodology that takes into account these four prongs, and it's an ever expanding knowledge base, of course, that we work with. But we think we've arrived at a good spot now of, I've done over 20,000 personal training sessions in my career, worked with hundreds of clients online, where we think we have a good base of experience to help, push that person down the path that they need to go. So lots of experience, man, lots of different, things we learned along the way.
Yeah, and I love that idea of personal evolution, and that's something that's really important to this show and really important to me because I think if you've been in this industry for a while, you start to realize how much of a victim you've fallen a prey to of that idea of being on top of Mount Stupid, right? And really thinking that you know everything there is to know, and that Dunning-Kruger effect is a real thing, man. And I find myself going through this rotation of, yeah, I got it this time. This is the right way. And then, nope, I'm an idiot. None of that was right. And things are continuing to evolve. And I think especially if you stay with your nose into the research, or at least if you're even remotely aware of what's going on in the exercise science industry, especially coming from the background that both you and I come from, you see that a lot of the things that we hold near and dear to ourselves, some of them are getting reaffirmed over over and over again in the literature, and some of them are just fucking not. Like we may have thought things were one way, but they're very much a different way. So with that in mind, give me something that's sort of changed for you. It could be, you mentioned you've been in the industry for over 10 years. What's something that you've changed your mind on? It could be in the last 2 or 3 years. It could be over the entirety of your career that you were pretty dang certain before, but doesn't seem to mean too much today, or has maybe even shifted, like a tectonic shift altogether in what the literature is kind of pointing to.
This is going to be an ironic answer because my answer is the amount of weight that I put on evidence from literature. Dude, when I started, I was the ultimate bro. I didn't care what any research study said, but ultimately, you still learn it from these like social media PhD type guys, like trickling it down to you, right? And then I started saying, okay, to take my training to the next level, I got to dive head first, nose deep into the literature, and that worked. And I learned a lot, I'd say. But ultimately, as I've gained experience, I keep finding myself, like you said, some things I agree with, some things I really disagree with, but they're not always directly correlated with what the research is saying. I used to do everything by the technical book. And then I started to realize that you could find a research study to support literally anything. And the context of those studies are oftentimes misinterpreted and misapplied. So I just don't dive as deep into as I once used to. I still read it to have perspective, but I think evidence is a hierarchy that has, the from the literature, but also anecdotal evidence. I think these are almost as equal as in any other field. So I think people try to keep putting one above the other, old school bro science or literature means everything. And I think ultimately neither of those coaches reached the real top. So it's just evidence in general, man. I used to put so much weight in it, but not anymore. It matters.
I
It's one more piece of the puzzle, right? It's not the whole puzzle.
Yeah, I love that answer. And even as I'm sitting here listening to you say that, it's shifting my perspective in the sense of like I think I intuitively agree and understand with that too, because there is a lot of stuff that you read and you're like, what the fuck? That's not true. Like, what population were they possibly performing this in? Or like, I've seen enough evidence anecdotally. And I think the power of anecdote is often dismissed, like you mentioned too, because we think of like personal anecdote. But between the two of us, we've done close to 50,000 personal training sessions. Like, that's pretty powerful anecdote compared to a small sub,
20
20 people.
participants, for
Yeah,
example, right?
exactly, in a small group, right? So I think there is certainly weight to people who have experience and who've actually seen how this stuff comes down to the ground and how it's delivered to participants. I do think that research is interesting in the sense of it challenges preconceived notions. And honestly, it's been this weird cycle for me too, because I was certainly a bro. Like find the big, I mean, that's literally the first word in bullshit, right? Is bros. And there's still part of me that follows that, right? Like find the biggest, strongest guy in the gym and see what the fuck he's doing, because he obviously knows something that the rest of us don't. And it's easy to dismiss that because there are so many other factors at play, genetics, PDs, all of those things. But there's still work involved in being the biggest guy in the gym, and that cannot be underestimated and taken for granted. So there's some balance, like you said, in that hierarchy of information of like the big guys know something, the PhDs probably know something too. The real answers are somewhere in the middle. And that's why I love and respect. I don't know if you follow Dr. Pack, but I love his little memes that he makes of like the over scientist, looking at every study person that's like, oh, I have to optimize every single variable versus really at the end of the day. I mean, if we could break down training into a few big buckets of what's most important, it'd be train really hard. Don't overtrain and try to kill yourself, and keep your volume reasonable. And reasonable is a really broad term because it can mean a lot of things. But like, but besides that, it's like if you're training consistently, you're going to see results over time. There's just no ifs, ands, or buts around it. So I love that. Anything else to add before we move on there?
I would say that was very well worded. It's not always sexy to say it like that, but ironically, also, that's what I think people are wanting to hear more and more. Now, there's still, like you said, those guiding lights, and I think as you gain experience, I've personally forgotten more things about exercise than most people will ever know. So it's one of those, you keep learning and keep evolving and, like I said, challenge your preconceived notions, but ultimately it's going to keep coming down to those few things. And like what we'll talk about today, I think is a perfect example of one of those. So I'm really excited to dive into that a bit.
Yeah, so with that in mind, let's jump into this. So we're going to be talking about speed of movement today. This was, we were trying to think of what to talk about, and this jumped out to me because I follow this guy. I'm sure you're familiar with him. I'm gonna butcher his name. Menno Henselman, I believe is how you say it. He's Colombian, maybe he's Spanish, some kind of Spanish.
He's
Brilliant guy. Yeah, he's ambiguously Spanish of some variety, but he is just a really good Instagram follow, posts lots of studies, does really cool breakdowns on everything. And he recently posted something that was a paper, I believe from 2019 or 2021, maybe. It's intentionally slow concentric velocity resistance exercise and strength adaptations, a meta-analysis. So this paper was basically looking at speed of movement and how it affects strength and hypertrophy outcomes. Just big picture, when you think about the different camps in the speed of movement, environment within our industry, what are sort of the big the fighting forces within that? Like, talk to us a little bit about your experience as a trainer and what it's looked like from the speed camp of you need to be moving fast, you need to be moving slow. What's sort of been your experience and evolution with that over the years?
Yeah, so when I started off at, Discover Strength, one of the big things was super controlled, like to the second counting and timing of seconds. 2 seconds out, 4 seconds back, lots of different tempos, up, down, slow, 10 seconds out, 10 seconds back. I was even part of a research study that was like 30 seconds or it was 30, 30, 30 or 60, 60, I believe were the two of the conditions studied. And I was in one of the slower ones and I lost muscle. And that's kind of what some of these research studies are saying is that you can move too slow. And that actually is counterproductive to gains. But, there's like the super slow, which I think has fallen out for a very good reason, is because it's not as effective. But then, as you push towards like this faster paced style of training, I also know it could be ineffective as well. I won't get to reasons why later, but ultimately, what a lot of research points to, and this is what I found as I've evolved as a trainer, is self-selected pacing is really the most effective. Because you look at the research and everything's kind of all over the place. It's sometimes it's more effective for strength, sometimes it's less effective for hypertrophy, and blah 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 blah. But self-selected, and that's going to what I've arrived to in my own training, based on a lot of factors we'll get to, is the most effective, I believe, for training strength or hypertrophy.
Yeah, this has been a really weird evolution for me as well because I actually started in the super slow camp. So the first gym that I ever worked at was a pure Ken Hutchins super slow. Like, I learned from the Ken Hutchins super slow manual, and it was like a revelation for me because I don't think that I had ever experienced that level of intensity, right? I was totally bro before that. I would work a lot, but I don't think I was working very hard. And that introduction to actually working hard, like, changed everything for me. So for me, it was actually like revolutionary. Like, when I started that style of training, 20 minutes twice per week, big five kind of movement patterns, maybe some low back thrown in there, I actually gained a shitload of strength. I actually gained a significant amount of muscle. And I was like a zealot right away. Like, I had found, the holy grail, and it was fantastic. And I think what I've learned over and, really changed my mind on over time is I think that that's a phenomenal way for people who have no idea what the fuck they're doing to strength train and have no idea what to do from an intensity perspective to really be introduced to safe, effective, really intense exercise in like the absolute safest way possible. Because what you said there, that self-selected exercise, I think when you've been doing this for a while, or self-selected speed of movement, I actually have that written down a little bit later as well. Like, I think that's sort of the camp that I'm in now. But I think as practitioners, as professionals, as people who are just enthusiastic about bodybuilding and strength training, we underestimate how many motor morons there are out there. People that have no idea how to push themselves, no idea how to move safely, no idea how to do any of this stuff. And if you just told them, hey, move at a speed that feels natural, they're either going to be moving way too slow, way too fast. They're going to risk their, injuries to themselves. Like, you walk into any gym in America that's just a regular public gym, a Planet Fitness, Crunch, any of those places, you're going to be people doing shit that's like, I guess that's their self-selected speed of movement, but holy fuck, that is scary. People should not be left to their own devices sometimes. So I always in the beginning really thought that speed of movement was super important, and I still do to some effect. But I think, again, when you look at the research and when you look at anecdotal experience, I don't really give a shit at all anymore. Like, once people have mastered the basics, I think finding a speed that works for them is super important. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so if you look at a lot of the research, it's on pacing. It's on untrained participants, or they're not advanced trainees, which is when, like you said, the self-selected tends to be potentially the most effective and safe, is when you're more experienced. So a lot of research is on the untrained populations, which we know they kind of respond to everything. But in some of the conditions that show that like slower, like 4 second eccentric can be more beneficial, it's typically in my experience because it's like you said, helping that person learn the movement a little bit better. And that's gonna be very even like limb length dependent and exercise selection dependent. But typically, the slower speed of motion is going to help them learn the motion, prevent injury, reduce pain, all these kinds of things. However, I still believe, and this is something I'm doing more of as I coach more people, allowing that self organization of movement, I believe, is a massive learning tool. So when you get someone to you for the first time, it's easy to try to say, I want you to go 2 seconds out, 4 seconds back. And that person is maybe going to nail it, maybe not. I like to see how they move first. So instead of giving them the tempo, I want to just see how they move. From there, allows me to be a little more individualized in my approach. So I have a lot of beginners coming to me that just naturally move a little bit slower. And so I don't need to force them into like these super specific controlled camps just because they're a beginner. I want them to somewhat self-organize that movement. And then ultimately, I start to, again, maybe let's go a little slower on the way back. I want you to push a little bit harder on the way out because I think you're going a little bit too slow. And then naturally, as you increase the loads, they try to push as hard as they can. It'll move a little slower because the load's just heavier. If that person has no shoulder pain on a press, I don't necessarily need to have them go as slow as maybe if someone's experiencing pain or losing their positioning. So that self-selected speed of movement, I would say, is still almost an end goal, and it shouldn't be dictated solely by how advanced someone is. I think it's based on their starting point and how you work them to that point. Does that make sense?
Yeah, 100%. And I love that idea of just watching people and seeing how they move first. I guess it's been my experience with the clients that I've worked with a lot of times that they crave direction, right? So if you just told them to sit down and try to do a specific exercise, you'd be like, but what do I do? How do I do it? Right. And that could just be my own personal experience of being in the situation I've been in for the last, 5, 6, 7 years where it's been so directive. But I love that idea of just watching how somebody moves first, how they understand their body, their proprioception, all of those things, and then making adjustments from there. And the reality is, like, even if you look at the Ken Hutchins like die hard literature, like those super slow manuals, which again, that's what I was ingrained with when I first started, there's a range on there, right? Like Ken specifically talks about the faster movement speeds are going to be like 6 seconds on the positive and negative. And on the slower end, for people with longer limbs or who can move exceptionally smoothly throughout, they might be as high as 12 or 14 seconds. So there's like a broad range even within that super strict modality. And I think, when it's just so easy to look at stuff at face value and get dogmatic about, okay, things have to be this way, they have to be that way. One of the things I wanted to pull up here just about this study in particular, as I was reading through it, is the specificity of strength, right? So when we see the reference to speed of movement a lot of times in research, what they're talking about, what they're trying to measure is strength, right? And strength, as we know, is super specific, right? So if you're moving quickly because your goal is to pull the heaviest fucking deadlift you can or press out the heaviest chest press you possibly can, like, yeah, you should be moving really fast. Probably as fast as humanly possible. That's why they have all this velocity-based training and these different techniques and tools to measure that stuff. But then when we apply that to the average person, it's like, okay, well, are you trying to compete in world deadlifting competitions? Well, no, then probably find the speed that works best for you. What are your thoughts on that? Just kind of bringing that research down to like the individual in the sense of, we see faster speeds correlate with higher strength output, correlate with higher increases in strength. And it's like, well, yeah, but that's mostly in Olympic lifts for people who are specifically trying to work on their Olympic lifts.
This is I'm going to give you a bit of a layered answer here, because if we look at the research on, what performs better, faster negatives, slower negatives, for example. Can't remember the name of the exact study, but I believe they were comparing 4 second eccentrics and 2 second eccentrics. And the protocols and the level of intensity with which they worked were different between the 2 and the 4. And ultimately, the 4 second eccentric had a harder protocol and they elicited more intensity, which we know ultimately is somewhat of a driver of hypertrophy to an extent. So the protocol alone dictated the outcome there. But when you start to look at them across all the studies and eliminate some of those confounding variables, it matters a lot less because, like you said, specificity is important. If you want me to test on a 4-second negative, well, I'm going to train on a 4-second negative. If I'm going to do a strongman event where I can touch and go deadlift, that's going to be way different than if I do a dead stop and I'm doing more of like a 1 rep max powerlifting style. I'm going to train that completely different. So specificity, I mean, is literally everything in strength training. And then when it comes to hypertrophy, we start to see even like specificity matters in terms of, regional hypertrophy and all these kinds of things. But across like protocols, it matters even just a little bit less than when you're training for strength, because in that case, strength does matter. So I won't get into like the mechanisms behind like the faster and the stretch reflex and all that kind of stuff, but I think even saying, well, faster speeds are for Olympic lifts and slower speeds are for hypertrophy, I also think that's a bit of a misguided statement, because ultimately, like in powerlifting, you're trying to move as fast as you can. The weight's just so fucking heavy, you can't move it fast. And in bodybuilding, like again, what is fast? What is slow? If you're moving super slow on the way down, that's going to somewhat affect how hard you can push on the way out, which we typically now recommend moving as fast as you can on the concentric. But I'm not an Olympic lifter. I'm a bodybuilder, right? So I would say like speed is like you said, very relative and very specific to what you're trying to ultimately test. But I still think as you go through these different types of sports with it, it matters differently as well. Does that make sense?
Yeah, 100%. And that, I love that super esoteric answer. What is fast? What is slow? And it really is all relative, right? So when you're, talk to me, because obviously your specialty, your focus is bodybuilding. So if I was a professional bodybuilder and I'm working with you and I see a paper like this that says, hey, we got to increase our strength by moving faster, what is your takeaway from something like this? How are you bringing that down to the ground for somebody whose actual goal should probably just be hypertrophy, right? And we know that's correlated with strength, but has different markers and has different outcomes depending on the types of training that you're doing. So how would you maybe explain that to somebody and really bring it down to the ground?
Yeah. So when we're looking at, moving lower for hypertrophy, you say faster or slower?
Faster. So this paper specifically was saying faster speeds
Yep.
for
Yeah,
strength.
moving
There
faster,
didn't seem
correct.
to be much of a
Yep.
difference for hypertrophy, but assuming somebody that's wanting to get bigger also wants to get stronger.
Well, and so one of the reasons I'll touch on the strength part real quick. One of the reasons why that strength piece is enhanced with the faster movement speed is because you're now allowing that stretch reflex, which is essentially there's muscle spindles and there's a couple other mechanisms that allow for like that storage of elastic energy to create a more powerful concentric. So moving a little faster on the eccentric is, as we know in the force velocity curve, going to produce more force, and then helps the concentric produce more force. So that's why you get more strength by moving a little bit faster. That stretch reflex is a massive component. When it comes to hypertrophy, it's kind of the same thing, because ultimately what we're trying to do is create force from the muscle. So ultimately on the way down, if we move, again, force velocity curve says on the eccentric, as we move faster, we generate more force. As we move slower towards an isometric or not moving at all, there's less force. It's inverse for the concentric. So the faster we move, typically the less force we produce. So when you're trying to move faster in a hypertrophy context, is faster on the way down, it's going to help generate force there. But then trying to move fast, but with the appropriate load, especially in your failure, is ultimately going to move it slow, which helps create the cross bridging you need to put tension onto the tissue. And then that's going to lead to the growth. Well, fast is in the hypertrophy context on the way down. You want to go fast enough where you can maintain tension on the muscle. Okay, you don't want to go too fast where you're just dropping through. Obviously, we need some tension on the tissue. You don't want to go so slow because you're not going to generate enough force, which is like what that muscle is outputting, right? And then on the way out, you don't want to move fast because you don't want to, not have force produced, but you want it so heavy and near failure, which also makes the speed slow down where that intent is fast. So if someone's saying move fast for hypertrophy, it's different based on the phase of the rep, but it's all about driving force, and that's tension on the muscle, which we know is what leads to growth.
Yeah,
Did
and
I bring
and
that around enough?
yeah, no, that was great. No, and it's super interesting too, because we've seen more and more. There's so many arguments in the high intensity training camp, and I've grown more and more disenfranchised with with that umbrella in general, just for various reasons. But this idea of constant tension on the muscle and getting to the appropriate amount of contractions that's going to drive that mechanism of hypertrophy and of growth. And I really think it's, it's super person dependent, obviously, on the amount of volume that you need in order to grow as much as possible. But it seems to be more than a lot of the people in the high intensity training camp would assume. I think, and I don't want to get too far off track because this is not really a volume conversation, but, I just think of all the people who are like Mike Menser, folks, and they're like, oh, it's, you can only take so much volume, you can only take so much intensity. And, the thing that's been popping in my head when I think about that argument recently is one, a massive amount of PEDs, right, from Menser and his brother. And
Yeah.
then two, like the
Went to the
intense,
brain.
yeah, the intensity of those workouts. And really just like when you think of old school hit workouts was so fucking high. Like, I don't think that the average human could actually take that. And then we look at like what you do in a random studio in, Cleveland, Ohio, of somebody who's a Arthur Jones follower, and they're like, we're so intense. And it's like, if you did what Casey Viator did, if you did what Mike Menser did, you would be dead. Like, you would be dead. So we can't really, like, if the intensity is up here, then yeah, maybe the volume can be down here. But for most of us, the intensity is like here, right? And I've
Well,
just
it's that intensity, but your ability to recruit fibers, take that to failure, the amount of load you put on the bar, and therefore, one part of relation to the amount of tension you put on the muscle, the way you execute, that all it changes as you become more advanced as well. And I wrote an article on that I'll be releasing soon. It's like an unbiased approach to volume. And what I have found throughout my career is that, that's the reason why new trainees can train full body 3 times a week and a professional bodybuilder can't. There's a reason why my big bodybuilder guys or my power lifters can only train 4 days a week. On like typically it's one, maybe twice for that muscle. Now you try to apply that to an average beginner and they'll see something because they respond to everything. But it's a very different situation. If I want to maximize growth for that person, I'm probably having to push volume just a little bit higher. But that's kind of beside the point. But to tie the volume into the tempo discussion here, time under tension was like a huge thing for a minute, right? How long is that muscle working for? The longer it works for, the more muscle we're going to go, right? Well, we know that that's no longer exactly the case. Like, it's not a 1-to-1 ratio of time to growth. Well, equated across weeks, like it doesn't matter as much, especially for hypertrophy. But what we have actually also found is that if you focus on moving so slow just to accumulate time under tension, you're actually reducing the amount of effective volume you're getting. Because and I'm not going to be a big proponent of like the effective reps theory, but we do know as we get closer to failure, we have a little bit different stimulus going on. So those last couple reps are really what matters. But if you're doing a rep that takes 2 or 3 times as long, you're still achieving the same stimulus, but I could have gone and done a whole nother set. And so now my time in the gym is doubled for the super slow for probably not any more gains and maybe more fatigue, which isn't going to be sustainable long term. So I think if you're like one of those hit trainees and you're doing this long, super slow type stuff, or even like 6-8 second negative type stuff, you are reducing the amount of work you can be getting in for the plethora of muscles you need to train. And in a 30-minute workout, I just physically, you can't accumulate the amount of work you need twice a week doing it like that, especially if you're doing it 6-8 second negative type stuff.
Yeah, and it's again, what is your goal, right? Is the goal just maintenance? Is the goal you're starting from ground zero and you're just trying to build something? Then sure, do a super slow type workout and do something that's literally just going to get you doing more than nothing, right? But if hypertrophy is your goal, if building as much strength as possible is your goal, I think you have to look at adding in some additional volume over time. And that's something. Talk about things that have changed for me is like looking at how to actually spread volume around in a smart and efficient manner, as opposed to just let's get in 7 exercises today of a single set of each. It's like, well, I can actually do like 14, 15 sets, maybe 20 sets in that same time frame if I'm actually doing things appropriately, not dilly-dallying in between sets, like moving from exercise to exercise. And then if you're really in a pinch, like if maximizing is not necessarily your goal, but you're looking at getting all that volume in, and I'm sure we've had this conversation before, doing things like supersets, right? And literally maximizing the amount of time with pushing and pulling, that you're keeping that efficiency in the gym. I mean, you can get 20 sets in if you're doing a superset workout in 15 minutes, like if you're doing it appropriately at a hotel gym or wherever it is. So that's something I've definitely shifted my mind on, and time under tension, especially, of, you have to cross X threshold in order to, to make this an effective set or an effective rep. I think if you look at the total volume, if you look at the total amount of time under tension throughout the sets, there's much smarter and more efficient ways to make use of that time. Yeah, I couldn't agree more on
It's
that.
kind of ironic if you want to be efficient to be doing 8-second negatives,
Yeah.
10-second negative. I think it's
Yeah.
very ironic.
Yeah, yeah, and I mean, again, it's the argument makes sense for people who maybe have never experienced with it. This is actually a really good transition of what would be some reasons to still move really slowly, and I could only think of one. And if you've got another one, feel free to jump in here. But it was just safety, right? Like if you're looking for somebody who's super fragile, if you're working with somebody who's never experienced anything from a muscular perspective before, this type of protocol, super slow especially, was literally developed for arthritic women in the 1980s at the University of Florida. Like that's who they developed this for, was people who were so frail and fragile that they couldn't do anything else. So if you're one of those 80-year-old osteoarthritic women, feel free to do super slow training, right? Or if you've got some kind of joint issues, if you're coming back from an injury, I still think there's applicability to this style of training. I just don't think it's meant for the masses the same way that I used to when I was first coming up.
Yeah, no, I would agree with that generally. Definitely, if you have issues with injuries or you're trying to learn a motion, move a little bit slower. But you need to think about also where in the motion are we moving slower? There's really one point that matters the most when it comes to injury prevention, and that's usually out of the stretch position, creating a contraction. Or like if you're doing an RDL, like that very bottom position, again, kind of a stretch position, but also mechanically, like on the low back, it's more vulnerable for other reasons too. There's just more load there. So I would say it's almost more important to understand where you're trying to move slow, just as much as why, because I could have someone move at a pretty steady pace, like 1 or 2 seconds on the way down. But as they hit the bottom, and you know how I coach, I focus on people trying to stay in a good position, think about sinking through tissues. I know there's a big thing on like this whole length and partials. And I know some people in like this hit community or something do like, let's pause in the length and range on everything. And I have people do that when I'm trying to really get them to nail their positioning. But at some point, too, I think just like arbitrarily pausing there is like, are we actually pausing there to pause to teach, or are we trying to get them to actually get better at moving through such that a really like 1 or 2 seconds spent in this range is going to be more effective than 10 seconds across the whole range? Right. So, like, where are they most vulnerable, load wise, mechanic wise? Have them be slower there versus just everywhere in the motion.
Yeah, I love that. And I actually have that when we're talking about communicating speed to clients. That's one of the things I literally have on here is I think eliminating momentum and jumping is what I called it is key, right? Like we actually want to make sure that what's the most important piece. I had smooth transitions are paramount. So if you're, I think we often take for granted how fast like muscles work in the sense of the connections of actin and myosin, and it's like, oh, if you're moving too quickly, it's like everything's unloaded, like all of a sudden everything disconnects, and it's like, well, no, all of these processes are like micro, super fast, right? So as long as you're not literally exploding through everything, your body's going to do what it's supposed to do. The muscles are going to stay under tension. But again, going into those compromise positions, I think it's super important to at least have an understanding of what a good transition should look like. How should you actually activate, and I think one of the words you use a lot of times is grab on, right? Grab on to that muscle, grab on with the muscle that you're actually working. How else do you think about explaining speed to people? What are some other cues, some teaching points that you like to use when you're talking about speed of movement with maybe somebody who's newer or even somebody who's advanced?
I have a lot of them. I'll get to in 2 seconds. On that topic of momentum, real quick, because this will tie into what I say. Momentum itself, like when you generate force, you therefore create momentum. So I think saying eliminate momentum is you're also eliminating force to some extent. Now, you could get into some definitions of like something that's static at rest has no momentum, but there can be forces acting on it, right? But to say like eliminate momentum, I think is a bit of a misnomer because technically, when we're out of the bottom and we have some force on the muscle, now we go to create more to push, we are creating momentum. So, momentum is not inherently bad. What I see be the issue is the orientations that you're moving around to create the force. So momentum is not bad because technically this is momentum and this is momentum and this has momentum, but that's smooth and controlled, right? What the issue is when people start to orient and get out of position to create that force, and that's when injuries occur and other things. Cues that I use to tie that in, things like grab and roll through muscle. I want people thinking about contractions as smooth gradients and that they can ramp up and down in speed and force production. So when you're coming down, for example, let's talk about chest press because that's a common one with shoulder pains and who doesn't want a bigger chest. As you come down, I say set rib cage down, closed mouth, nice inhale through the nose, and that helps to externally rotate the rib cage and the shoulders. You're now a nice strong position. And as you're coming down, you're sinking, 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 imagining that muscle lengthening out. As you start to press, you get a little pressure through your palm, you grab it on pec, and you roll through or you slide through. I use cues that elicit feelings of like smoothness, right? Because slow is smooth, right? And smooth is fast. So I don't talk about eliminating momentum because I think that creates these jerky type motions. I talk about being rolling and almost rolling with that momentum to extent. Let the momentum of that load coming down stretch you, right? Because we want that stretch reflex again to have a strong push on the concentric. So let that momentum go with you and go with the momentum and then leverage it and roll through the motion.
Yeah, and
Maybe
and
that's a
some
bit of
of
a
some of this
shift.
seems semantical, but I think it actually is super important from a client's perspective because I've found that cueing in specific ways works better for certain people, right? So I think having, obviously I'm definitely a somebody who's used that let's kill the momentum, let's eliminate momentum thousands of times in my career, so I'm guilty. But I love that idea of everything does have momentum, obviously, when we're talking about force production. But I think sometimes a lot of times clients understand what you're getting at, right? But I think finding other words that you can input there, especially with somebody who's maybe more advanced or somebody who's done this before. And I love that idea of like thinking of speed on a gradient, right? One of the first analogies that I heard in super slow was like, how slow can you approach a stop sign without stopping, right? And I've used that tons of times in my career. Like your wife's pregnant in the back, you're on your way to the hospital, four-way stop, there's three cops at all the other intersections. How slow can you go without actually stopping and roll through and not get pulled over? And that was super helpful for me in the beginning of how do I make these transitions out of the hole or wherever it might be, without actually whether it's sinking into the stretch first, using that stretch reflex, all of those things. What
I
are
think
some?
that's an I think
Go
that's
ahead.
an awesome cue. I think it's an awesome cue, by the way. That
you
stop sign
you
cue. I
can use
like that.
that.
But if you think about it too, like it's just that deceleration at the very, very bottom. Just to wrap kind of that point up is like the idea of using words or not. I agree. Clients will totally get what we mean when we say eliminate momentum. But then what I see become the issue is it becomes a dogmatic way of thinking, or it gets perpetuated by those who don't. In the first place, it's like the game of telephone. Like you knew what you meant, but now the client doesn't fully know. They just heard stop momentum, and it was effective for them in the moment. But now they go out, and let's say they become a social media influencer, and they perpetuate that. Everyone's saying stop all momentum, and it's just could be wrong and skewed, right? So I think it is important, and as trainers it's important we take the onus to like get these things right because they are ultimately what our clients are going to start telling everybody else too. So you know
Yeah, and that's something that's been interesting for me too with clients and just personally, as I've grown and developed as a trainer is because I was one of those dogmatic people and everything had to be 2-4 and you had to be in a certain rep speed and cadence or 10-10 depending on when the time was. And it's now my focus really is, I've had clients that have been with me for a while that are like, is my speed okay? And I'm like, does it feel okay? Like I don't
exactly.
see you doing anything wrong. You're not bouncing off the bottom. You're not, moving too jerky or anything like that. And I think again, like you said, it's sort of that telephone thing. I think sometimes our clients, especially, think the world of us and think that we are 100% right all the time and don't realize that we're constantly evolving too. And so I've noticed sometimes there's been a little discrepancy between myself learning and then people being like, "Wait, I thought we were doing it this way. Like, are we changing things there?" So having those conversations with people, I think, is super important. And conversations like this between, between people who have experience where our clients could listen, where they could go, okay, so there is some nuance to this. It's not one way or the other. And you want to be working with somebody who's actually continually learning and continually upskilling themselves and continually challenging what they think they know, so they're not completely caught in this dogma of, this is the way I learned it, this is the way it always has to be. So I think that's awesome.
Yep. I
What
didn't mean to
else?
interrupt your question. So
No, no,
yeah,
go ahead. Go ahead.
no, 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 no. You were going to say something before I interrupted on that point.
I have no idea. So go ahead.
Yeah. No, I love that, man. And I think as trainers, I heard a quote the other day, and it was, if you still think exactly the same way you did 15 years ago, that's a problem. And at some point, you hope that your initial thought process is logical and objective and well thought out. So, I do believe like nuances can, at some point, you got a pretty damn good idea of what's going on, but it just takes a lot of experience to get to that point. And if you ultimately care about your clients, you'll take what it is, you'll do what it needs to get to that point where you can apply the nuance to them. And I think a lot of trainers shy away from digging into those conversations with their clients because they don't want to appear wrong and vulnerable in that regard, or they don't understand how to like break down the nuance because they've been told that, clients don't care about the nuance. Well, they're working with you for a reason. So you got to find a way to communicate it differently.
Yeah, and I think that's something we both probably experience is that clients absolutely love the nuance, whether or not they understand it fully. I think people are not dumb, and this is in general. This is one of the things I ran into, with a podcast that I was doing is, the recommendation was let's keep this as short as possible. People don't care. They want 20-minute tidbits. And then the reality was when I was having conversations with clients, it's like, oh, we like the ones that are longer. We like when you go a little bit deeper. If you look at the most popular podcasts in the world, like they're all over 2 hours, 3 hours long. And I don't think every podcast needs to be that long, but I think people crave dissection. They crave interesting conversation. They crave somebody who's willing to openly challenge their belief systems and admit when they're wrong, most importantly, because that's such a rare thing to see nowadays. So I don't think the nuance is lost on people. And again, whether or not they actually understand and intuitively like get it, I think that people who work with trainers like you and I, coaches like you and I, really are with us. They want to be with us because of that understanding, of that expertise, of that willingness to challenge pre-existing notions. So I don't think we should undermine that at all. And if anything, I think we should dive even further into it. What else do you got on speed, Jack? I'd love to hear any other thoughts. I know you said you had a bunch of notes here, things that you think are important to people before we wrap this up.
Yeah. From a programming perspective, I no longer, especially for my bodybuilders, I no longer write tempos in there unless there's an injury. So I think from just like a high, like let's some practical takeaways from a programming perspective. If you're a coach, I don't write down tempos just because I think it gets conflated. Like, what if a guy is 6'4" or my wife who's 4'10"? Why would I do a 4-second squat? They're going to be completely different. So that again, like especially with more high level people, just have them send you videos and you can assess their form, and we're in person if you work with them in person. That's number one. I think it is interesting now if you do think about like, well, how can we apply tempo to things other than just injury prevention, like outcomes of strength versus hypertrophy? Let's talk like a deadlift, for example, like a dead stop versus a touch and go. We know that on a touch and go, the ground is providing some force back up, and that's going to help you move through the motion. So from a strength and output perspective, the muscles are probably doing a little bit less, at least from that technical breakdown perspective. The total load you can move, though, is a little more because you're getting assistance from the ground, which if that's your goal in powerlifting, that's maybe the objective. If you're a bodybuilder trying to make the muscles work as hard as possible, maybe then you want to eliminate some of that touch and go. You want to do more of a dead stop. Even then, like the stretch shortening cycle takes a few seconds to truly dissipate, up to 4 seconds, like truly dissipate. So almost more like singles at that point, right? You're resting it for a second, getting back into it. And then there's that question now of, okay, well, what if I want to maximize hypertrophy? Do I need to like do a true dead stop, especially if it takes that long to dissipate the stretch shortening cycle? Well, if you think about it, now you can move more load because you're doing a bit of a touch and go, and maybe that is also therefore a stressor enough on the muscle to create a stimulus. So again, and now the practical takeaway from a strength versus hypertrophy perspective, there is some application to tempo because it can be exercise and range of motion specific for strength gains. From a hypertrophy standpoint, I think a lot of this comes down to it levels out in the end as long as you're working really fucking hard. So hopefully those are like a couple of key takeaways in terms of programming perspectives and what you can do in the gym.
Yeah, I mean, I think training in general, especially from a hypertrophy perspective over the long term, could be broken down to what you just said there. Training really fucking hard and consistently for a really long time.
Yeah,
It doesn't,
move it as fast as you can on the way up and control it on the way down. Make sure it's on tissues and then roll back through
yeah.
hard. That's
Yeah,
it.
I think that's great advice, and obviously there's a lot of research coming out too. Just from it's been interesting to see the research on older individuals, right, and the recommendations towards moving fast to improve force output and to improve strength and to improve power specifically for older individuals that lose all those things as they get older. So this idea it's almost counterintuitive again to what I was taught of. Well, these people are frail; they need to do this extra slow speed and this extra slow movement. And that might be a great starting point, especially if you've never done anything before. But at some point, like we have to challenge ourselves. We have to do things appropriately. And if you're focusing on form and on control, big C control, right? Not small, minute control, I think you're going to get the outcomes that you're looking for. You look like you wanted to add something there.
Yeah, the rate of force development in regards to specifically athletic populations and elderly populations. So that force velocity curve, you can take it and shift it to the right, like the whole curve. You're producing more force at different speeds because of things like your improvement in rate of force development. So again, this is all really what is your goal? I think this is where we started this entire conversation. But I tend to see more benefits from moving a little faster than moving too slow. It only seems like we see detriments from moving too slow. And of course, the detriment of moving too fast is injury, but within a reasonable perspective, like I would typically move a little faster. But
Yeah.
especially if you're an athlete who's trying to improve that rate of force development.
Yeah, and I think when I even say slow now, I'm definitely not talking about super slow in general. I would say, slow is just being under control the entire time, right? And I think, from a safety perspective, if you have the weight under control in both directions, I think you're probably fine, right? When it comes to injury risk, to all of those things, it's probably more, like you said, from a compromised position standpoint. Honestly, now, again, take the research with a grain of salt. We've seen this anecdotally as well, but it doesn't seem that form is even that important as kind of coming out, right? If you're actually working with a high level of intensity, now I would argue, right, if you're doing specific exercises over a long time, form is probably a little more important, just from a safety perspective long term. But short term, it doesn't seem like valgus of the knees is one I've seen a lot recently. Deadlift form, like a little kyphosis in the back, doesn't actually seem to be that detrimental to strength and hypertrophy gains, at least in the short term. Any thoughts on that before we wrap this up?
Absolutely. Positional isometrics are a really common use in physical therapy, getting to a certain position and then holding that to develop strength and capacity in that range of motion. But so how do you apply that to like, exercise? It means that when you're moving, if you want to produce a ton of force, I would get in as much, as stable of a position as possible, right? And then typically you can just ride right through that motion. Like if you're in a good position with good loading from the good machine, all these good things, you can work a lot harder and not worry as much about speed and even technique. The more locked in you are, the safer you're going to be. But from even something like an eccentric isometric perspective in physical therapy, if we need to expose someone to a new position, getting there and like loading there is really really important, meaning that like sometimes we don't, in bodybuilders or even gen pop, we live in like these very linear ranges of motion. We don't get in these transverse planes and other planes. So I very much agree with that like even form is very questionable. Like what is good form? And it's very much based on how much force and how much load you're looking to output. with some knee valgus and some internal rotation on my hips and whatnot, I can only produce so much force on a squat before I have issues. But if I want to train that for some reason, I just have to be able to scale it to the proper amount of loading and intensity. And that's what physical therapy focuses on. If someone who had an injury in that previous position, how do we get them back there? You got to load it to some extent. You can't just avoid it forever. So
Yeah, I think that's just a super important caveat there as well. So last thing, just takeaways I had is speed overall. I just think it's not that important, right? We shouldn't overanalyze necessarily the speed of movement if your goal is just specifically overall improvements in health and wellness. Working with a coach that can help you dial in on what is the right speed of movement for you. And then obviously keeping those transitions as safe as possible, loading appropriately, making sure you're not putting yourself in compromising positions. Now, if your goal is strength output, if you are an Olympic lifting athlete, then yeah, speed is probably a little more important than the average person. But I think just for overall gains in health and wellness, it's finding what works for you, listening to your coach. And then really, I think this one's super important is experimenting, right? Not every exercise has to have the exact same speed of movement too. And that's something that I've definitely come to realize on my own in my own training over the years and working with other clients is the squat that you're doing is not necessarily going to be the same speed of movement as the chest press, which isn't going to look like the shoulder press, which isn't going to look like the pull down. You don't have to have a consistent speed of movement for each and every exercise. It just has to be the speed that works for you, that feels good for you on that particular movement. Anything else to add before I let you go here, Jack?
no, man, I think those are all really, really good points. And I think your own speed of movement will evolve as you go through your own training lifespan. Let's say you get more range of motion on a squat. Now all of a sudden you're getting more range of motion. Are you still maintaining the 4 seconds? Or are you getting an extra second there? Or are you speeding it up across the whole motion? So just evolve is I think the takeaway from all this, whether you're as a coach trying to evolve your knowledge or as your client, make sure you're evolving your understanding of your body and your movements, and do not get stuck in dogmatic thinking. Not everything needs to be a 2-4 pacing. And again, move fast on the way out and control the way down, and you'll have good gains no matter your outcome goal.
Yeah, I love that. I love that, and I think that's a perfect way to end. So, everyone, please like and subscribe if you haven't already. Follow both of us on Instagram. Jack is at Jacked&Leen, JACKEDNLEEN. And I think I got that right. It's also on your little name tag there, so it makes it pretty easy. And then if you are in the Minnesota area, make sure you keep an eye out for the Jacked&Leen Gym, which will hopefully be coming summer, fall, winter.
Yeah, summer, fall, that's the goal.
Awesome. Well, thank you again, as always, for joining me, Jack. It's always a pleasure to chat with you and pick your brain and fear the beard. So thanks for being here, and thanks
Let
everyone
me
for
pick up that
listening.
next time we meet.
Perfect. All right. Thanks everyone, and we will see you soon.